Tucked away from the world's noise on a remote island, 65-year-old Harlan Finch believed he had finally found peace. He had no neighbors, no nosy visitors, just the sea's hush and the tang of salt in the air. But when a cartel-linked smuggling ring arrived unannounced, they mistook him for nothing more than an old recluse. What they never imagined was that this quiet island belonged to a retired Navy Marine Combat Instructor, a man who once trained the deadliest fighters alive. Their plan was simple: turn this isolated stretch of sand and jungle into a hidden drug hub. Harlan's plan? To protect the one place he'd truly made his own. What started as a covert landing soon erupted into a fierce struggle pitting cunning, experience, and the indomitable resolve of an old warrior against ruthless criminal ambition. Quick pause before we continue. Welcome to Fabled Frames. Please tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow's story is mind-blowing. Part 1. Harlan Finch had come to think of mornings as sacred. Every dawn brought a hush over the island's dense vegetation, a poignant reminder that he was truly alone out here, on this remote atoll, little more than a crescent of land shaped by millennia of ocean currents. There was usually nothing but the whisper of breeze through palm fronds, the lapping of turquoise waves against the shore, and a vast silence that dwarfed the span of any human life. He rose from his hammock at the break of first light. Dawn was merely a tinge of pale rose across the horizon, showing through the wide windows of his stilted beach shack. At 65, his joints sometimes complained, a faint echo of the decades he had spent in the line of duty. He was thick-chested and had once been taller, but now age had settled him into a slight stoop. His skin, weathered by too many hot suns and salty winds, pulled tight over a wiry musculature honed by a lifetime of discipline. Once upon a time, he'd been a Marine Corps combat instructor. He'd run recruits into the ground, molded them into living weapons. He'd made some of the deadliest men in the military even deadlier. He left the hammock with a fluid grace, the kind of economy of movement that never really leaves a Marine. Outside, perched on the modest balcony, he began his morning ritual, a slow sequence of stretches and bodyweight exercises. Despite his age, Harlan handled push-ups and planks with the ease of a man half his years. His mind, even more than his body, felt razor-sharp. He flexed and stood. The emerging dawn revealed the sky in sumptuous colors now. Peach pink, lilac purple, a glimmer of gold in the east. To the west, thick jungle-like foliage pressed up around a network of rocky hills and old coconut groves. This island, his island, had once been used by privateers, pirates, and unscrupulous merchants as a secret berth. He'd discovered bits of old chain and rusted anchoring gear in the shallower waters over the years. He'd read diaries that told of criminals and castaways. Yet all that was well in the past. At least that's what he believed. He turned his face into the gentle, salty wind. Birds circled overhead, gannets, perhaps, searching for an early meal. Harlan closed his eyes, letting the hum of the ocean settle him. When he opened them, he felt that old pang in his chest. Some days it was easier. Some days the memories of the life he'd left behind weighed heavily on his heart. But if anything or anyone ever tried to disturb his new peace, he was ready. He went back inside. The shack was built from driftwood and scavenged planks, though sturdily assembled. Harlan was nothing if not resourceful. He'd lashed everything together with rope made of braided coconut fibers, and anything metal he'd hammered with his own two hands using leftover scraps from his boat. The boat itself, an old sloop named the Arcadia, sat on the far side of the island in a more sheltered cove, out of sight from prying eyes. Harlan had moored it there a few years ago when he first arrived. It was a purposeful move. Keeping the boat hidden reduced the chance of trespassers suspecting the island was even inhabited. He prepared a Spartan breakfast, dried fish salted by the sun, a sliver of fresh papaya, and a small coconut from a tree out back. Carefully, he shaved its top with a machete, letting the water fill a wooden cup before carving out the sweet pulp. He ate slowly, mindful of each bite, occasionally stepping outside to watch the breeze ruffle the palm fronds. Life here was simple, a sort of penance he'd chosen. He wanted no part of the world's noise. He wanted to live out his final years in quiet reflection, away from old scars and regrets. But fate, or maybe some darker force, had other plans. A visitor from the mainland. Mid-morning, a sound broke the hush. The distant, uneven drone of a small outboard motor. Harlan froze, half-chewed fish in his mouth, instantly alert. The old instincts, sharper than steel, sparked to life. He stepped out onto the sand, scanning the horizon. Far off, no more than a quarter-mile from the beach, was a small boat. It had a single engine on the back, cheap and sputtering, and from this distance, Harlan could see only one passenger, possibly two. The boat puttered forward, bobbing in the gentle swells. Harlan's first impulse was caution. He wanted to let them drift by, see if they had a reason to land. The surrounding waters were littered with hidden reefs that made navigation tricky, but not impossible. He watched, noting how the boat angled slightly toward his cove. He slung a battered pair of binoculars from a nearby hook and squinted through them. At once he recognized a face. Julio, a fisherman from a nearby coastal village. Harlan had met him once on a supply run. Julio lived in a small settlement about 50 miles across the sea, where there was a tiny port and a handful of huts. Occasionally, they traded. Julio was a kind man, but more importantly, he was discreet. Harlan lowered the binoculars and let the tension in his shoulders ease. Perhaps Julio needed help or wanted to trade fresh produce for some dried coconut or fish. So Harlan stepped forward, waiting as the boat slowly neared the shallows. The fisherman jumped out into thigh-deep water and waded to the shore, tugging the boat behind him by a rope. "Mr. Finch," he called, voice breathless. "I am sorry to bother, but I have news. Not good news." Harlan's brow furrowed, though he forced the corners of his mouth into the friendliest expression he could muster. "Easy, Julio," he said. "You look spooked." He offered the man a hand and helped haul the boat onto the sand, making sure the hull was clear of the gentle tide. Then he reached for the few burlap sacks inside. They were lighter than he expected, only a few meager fish. The man was frantic, though, eyes darting around the island's lush perimeter. "I do not mean to intrude on your privacy," Julio began, casting a wary glance over his shoulder. "But word on the mainland is that something bad is stirring. Very bad. I thought you should know." Harlan frowned. There was a prickle on the back of his neck, that intangible sense that told him to be wary. "Go on," he said, voice measured. Julio took a breath. "A group of men, from what I hear, are from a cartel-linked smuggling ring. Some say they work with the Santoro cartel. Others say they're independent but aligned with them. They've been moving north along the coast, scouting new places to transport their goods. Rumors say they're heavily armed and ruthless. They go where there are few eyes. The villages are afraid." Harlan listened calmly, nodding. "But why come to me? I'm an old man. I don't meddle in these things, Julio." The fisherman's eyes dropped to the sand, then drifted toward the shack, as if expecting danger at any moment. "Because they were in my village 2 nights ago," he continued softly. "One of them got drunk at the cantina, bragging that they'd found the perfect shipping route, isolated, out of the Coast Guard's path, an island with a hidden cove where they can stash contraband on the way north. He said they'd clear out any locals if they had to." Harlan's heart thumped, though externally he remained cool as stone. "An island with a hidden cove," he repeated. Julio nodded, his voice grim. "It matches the description of this place. And your cove is well known among certain smugglers from the old days. Everybody in my village knows you live here, but they keep quiet because you bring us no trouble. But these men, they pay for information. We suspect they've already bribed some fishermen who told them how to find you. They might think you're just a harmless hermit." Harlan could almost taste the salt in the air as he turned his gaze to the horizon. "Any idea when they'll get here?" "Soon," Julio said. "We think within days. Maybe less." Harlan pursed his lips. A swirl of old instincts and new dread coiled inside him. He'd come here to escape violence, yet it was violence that had come to his doorstep. He laid a steady hand on Julio's shoulder. "You did the right thing by warning me," he said quietly. "Now get home and keep your head low. They might not appreciate you warning me." Julio nodded, looking relieved. He brushed away the sweat beading on his brow. I hope everything will be okay, Mr. Finch. I wish I could do more." Harlan's mouth was a grim line. "Don't worry about me. Just be safe." He helped Julio push the boat back into deeper water. The fisherman gave Harlan a final, worried wave and climbed in. The outboard coughed, and soon he was chugging away, the engine noise fading. Harlan stood silent on the sand for a long while, letting the water swirl around his ankles. There had always been a chance, he knew, that unscrupulous men might come here. The island's geography made it a perfect hideout for criminals. That was part of why he chose it for himself. It was isolated, but also historically recognized by people looking to dodge official patrols. He had accepted that risk. But now the threat was real. Finally, he sighed and trudged back up the beach. The sun was already climbing, heating the sand beneath his feet. As he went, his sharp eyes scanned the treeline, the rocky outcrops, the coconut palms. And he knew what he must do. He would prepare. Memories and preparations. In the small shack, Harlan kept a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. He kneeled there, prying up 2 planks, revealing a cache of items from his old life. There was a battered trunk, the kind one might see in a military supply depot. The trunk's corners were dented, the latches half-rusted. With some effort, he clicked it open. Inside, a uniform, dress blues that no longer fit, and his old service boots, cracked leather from disuse. But that wasn't what he needed. He reached deeper, rummaging until his fingers brushed the cool metal of a combat knife. Then, gently, he lifted an M1911 pistol wrapped in an oilcloth, a relic from times long past. He inspected it. The grip was worn, but the slide moved smoothly. Carefully, he checked that the magazine spring still functioned, and he had to smile, Old Faithful still in perfect condition. He had precious few bullets, but it was enough to start. Harlan had a handful of spare magazines, each loaded with .45 ACP rounds. He wasn't planning to launch a war, just defend himself if the moment came. He closed the trunk, stashing the weapon inside his waistband for now. A part of him hoped the smugglers wouldn't appear, that it was all just rumor. But something in his gut told him it was certain. They would come. Men who smuggled contraband didn't fear an old hermit. They feared losing money or losing product. When they arrived, they'd see him as a nuisance. This island was his. He'd keep it that way. For the next hours, Harlan scouted the terrain. Though the island was only about 4 miles in circumference, it held pockets of rocky gullies and narrow beaches, places where vegetation was thick. He had favored vantage points high atop the sloping hills, places he could hide and watch. There was an old cave system, partially collapsed by storms over the years, that cut through the bedrock on the northern point. A single entrance big enough for a crouching man opened near the lagoon. Harlan had used it occasionally to store emergency supplies. He moved methodically. In a rucksack, he carried a coil of rope, a few sharpened stakes whittled from driftwood, and a short spool of heavy wire. A man who once trained the deadliest Marines alive did not take a threat lightly. Harlan was no stranger to rigging simple traps, non-lethal tripwires, bits of fishing line that gave him an early warning if someone was skulking around. By midday, he had set up a series of alarms in the undergrowth near the southwestern shore. They were little more than tin cans filled with pebbles, attached to tripwires that would rattle loudly if disturbed. He placed others along the old pirate trail that led into the inland jungle. The heat was relentless, and sweat trickled down his back. But he pressed on, determined. In a small clearing near the center of the island, he pried open an old crate he'd buried. Inside were a few supplies, salted meats, water canisters, and an antique scope he'd once used for target shooting. He packed these into his rucksack. For good measure, he used mud to camouflage the crate's lid again. Late in the afternoon, Harlan returned to his shack to catch his breath. He brewed a quick cup of tea from local herbs, a habit he'd picked up to calm his nerves. The pistol sat on the table, a silent reminder that the old ghosts never really let go. His mind churned through contingency plans. The smugglers might come in broad daylight, or perhaps wait until nightfall to land a larger boat full of contraband. They might stake out the island first or simply storm ashore with guns drawn. Harlan didn't have the resources to stand toe-to-toe with a well-armed force, especially if they had automatic weapons. But he had the advantage of terrain. He knew every inch of this island. He knew how to vanish into the brush, how to circle around from behind, how to set ambushes. Still, a piece of him bristled at the idea of going lethal right away. He was not a monster, not some renegade. He was just a man who wanted his solitude. Perhaps if the smugglers realized the island wasn't as deserted as they thought, they'd leave him be. But Harlan doubted it. Cartel henchmen didn't back off for one old man. Evening shadows stretched across the sand, painting the treetops gold. Harlan climbed the slope behind the shack, where a narrow path led to a craggy overlook. From there, he could see the western horizon. If any large vessel approached, he'd spot it by the glint of the setting sun on its hull. He stood there, scanning, until the sky burned a deep, dusky orange. No sign of trouble, yet he felt the tension in the air, as palpable as the heat. Shadows of the past. That night, Harlan dreamt fitfully. Memories from years in the Marine Corps played through his mind. He saw himself in boot camp, barking orders at raw recruits who trembled in their boots. He saw deployments overseas, dusty roads in desert towns, jungles thick with humidity, the muzzle flashes of night engagements. He heard the radio squawk of a mission gone awry, saw the silent, staring eyes of men who wouldn't return home. The images shifted. In the dream, he was back on this island. A group of men in black tactical gear landed on the beach. They carried assault rifles, their faces hidden behind masks. They marched with grim precision, scanning for threats. Harlan watched from behind thick foliage, pistol in hand. He felt his heart pound. As he prepared to slip away, one of the men turned and stared straight at him. Harlan jerked awake, breath catching in his throat. His hammock swung gently in the night breeze. The moonlight poured through the half-open window, illuminating the far wall. Outside, the sea murmured. He listened for any unusual sounds. All was quiet. He relaxed, exhaling. The tension was there, thrumming inside him like a coiled spring. He swung his legs over the edge of the hammock and reached for a sip of water. His mind drifted toward the men he'd trained, some who became unstoppable forces in the field. He used to pride himself on the notion that he molded not just skilled fighters, but men with unwavering loyalty and a sense of moral duty. Men like Staff Sergeant Wells or Corporal Morales. He wondered where they were now. With a tired sigh, he tried to settle back. Sleep came in fractured segments the rest of the night. An ominous arrival. Dawn broke with fiery splendor, but this time there was no tranquility in Harlan's mind. He sensed it before he heard or saw anything. That intangible gut feeling, that gooseflesh on his forearms that signaled danger. He was halfway through his routine of sit-ups on the balcony when he paused, heart skipping. Sure enough, there came the distant hum of engines. Plural. Not the rickety sputter of Julio's little boat, but something deeper, more powerful. Harlan scrambled for his binoculars. He kept them perched on a stool. Adjusting the lens, he scanned the horizon. At first, he saw nothing but water stretching to meet the sky. Then he spotted them. Two dark vessels, bigger than fishing boats. Long, sleek hulls that parted the water at speed. They were a few miles out, angled directly for the island's southern point. They moved with purpose. Harlan's chest constricted. "They're here," he whispered to himself. He hurried inside, quickly securing the few essentials. He donned sturdy cargo pants, a worn green t-shirt, and laced-up boots that had seen better days but still held firm. He clipped the holster for his pistol to his belt. He slipped the combat knife into a sheath on his thigh. Outside, the island's hush felt thick with anticipation. The overhead sun was only just beginning to bake the beach, but sweat already beaded on Harlan's neck. He took a final glance at his shack, a humble little structure. He doubted it would remain untouched if these men truly were who he feared. He quickly set a small booby trap at the shack's entrance. A tripwire that would pull the pin on a small flare. It wouldn't kill anyone. He had no interest in murder unless forced, but it would cause enough confusion and commotion if they barged in. Then he disappeared into the foliage, becoming a phantom. Harlan chose a vantage point near the southern cove where the vegetation thinned to scattered shrubs and coastal grasses. He nestled behind a large boulder and peered through the binoculars once more. The two boats were close now, just beyond the reef. One looked like a modified speedboat, painted black with tinted windshields. The other was smaller, though still sporting an outboard engine more powerful than anything used for casual fishing. He spotted about 6 men between the two vessels, possibly more if some stayed seated out of view. They wore mismatched gear: cargo pants, bulletproof vests, tactical belts. A few had bandanas or baseball caps. Harlan saw the telltale glint of weapons slung over their shoulders, rifles of some sort. They slowed near the reef. One man pointed, indicating where the deepest channel lay, a route that avoided the sharp coral. They navigated carefully, then gunned the engines closer to shore. With a final roar, they beached the vessels. Harlan counted them as they disembarked. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 men, all armed. 2 seemed to be giving orders. A tall, lean man with a shaved head, and a broad-chested figure with a gold chain around his neck. They barked commands in Spanish. From his vantage, Harlan picked out fragments. "Secure the perimeter. Check for signs of life. We'll scout. Set up a perimeter before the main shipment arrives." So they planned to bring in more. This was just an advance team. Harlan also heard a snippet that chilled him. "If someone's here, remove them." He took a steadying breath, letting the old instincts guide him. He had to remain unseen. Perhaps if he waited, he could sabotage their operation quietly, scaring them off. But if they were determined and well-armed, scaring them might not be enough. The group split into smaller teams, fanning out along the beach. 2 men stayed behind to watch the boats, leaning on them casually but with rifles resting across their chests. Another duo headed east, toward the rocky outcrops. The rest, for men, moved inland. Harlan, hugging the vegetation, followed the inland group's progress from a distance. He used every ounce of his woodland training, stepping silently, avoiding snapping twigs, keeping the wind in his favor to mask his scent. The men, for their part, seemed confident. They scanned the area, rifles at the ready, but they spoke loudly to one another in Spanish, sometimes joking. As they approached the thickening jungle, one man muttered something about finding the old shack. It was a guess, but the rumor must have traveled to them. They must have known he lived in some kind of hut. Another man responded with a laugh, talking about an old fisherman or hermit. Harlan grimaced, so they assumed he was merely a fisherman. They'd soon learn otherwise. They moved deeper. One of his tripwire alarms was strung across a narrow footpath. Harlan tensed, lying prone in the underbrush. As they approached, one of the smugglers, a wiry fellow with tattoos on his neck, jerked to a stop and signaled with a hand. The footpath was heavily overgrown, but the man must have spotted the faint glint of wire or the slight tension among the leaves. He motioned to the man behind him, who approached carefully. They paused, scanning, rifles aimed. With a curt scowl, the tattooed man reached out with a gloved hand to yank the tripwire free. The tin can rattle never got a chance to sound. Harlan's jaw tightened. These men had some skill. They were no greenhorns who'd blunder into every trap. They pressed on, more cautiously. Harlan let them go. There were more cunning ways to force them to choose a different path. A warning shot. From the hillside, Harlan watched them approach the area near his shack. He could see them pushing through tall grass, the shack's weathered walls gleaming in the midday sun. One man advanced first, stepping onto the wooden deck. A second man circled to the side, scanning the windows. Meanwhile, the other two kept watch, rifles raised. Harlan's heart hammered. He had to make a choice. Remain hidden and hope they left, or intervene. If they discovered the booby-trapped entrance and decided to tear the shack apart, they'd find his hidden supplies. Possibly they'd burn it down for good measure. He exhaled slowly, recalling the countless times he'd taught recruits about controlling their adrenaline in high-stakes scenarios. Then the first man tried the door. The tripwire triggered in a flash. A small pop erupted inside the shack. Bright red smoke spewed out from cracks in the doorframe, the flare. Immediately, a shrill hiss and the stink of burning chemicals filled the air. The men jumped back, startled, coughing. One cursed violently in Spanish. Another rattled off questions. Who's in there? Who rigged this? They spun around, pointing rifles at the treeline. Harlan was already relocating, crouching low, circling to a second vantage point so he wouldn't be spotted. One man, presumably the leader of this four-man squad, shouted orders to find who did this. Another recommended they torch the shack. But the leader, the broad-chested man, spat. Not yet. We need to see if there's anything we can salvage. Equipment, intel, something. They advanced in a crouch, entering the shack with smoke still drifting out the door. Two men stayed outside, scanning with anxious eyes. Harlan's mind clicked. Time to scare them. Before they destroyed his home, he raised his pistol. He took aim at a patch of sand near the men. He didn't want to kill them yet, only to show he wasn't to be taken lightly. He breathed in, steadied his grip, and fired a single round into the ground. Bang! Sand kicked up inches from the foot of one startled smuggler. The man scrambled back, tripping over a broken coconut husk. The other outside guard shouted, "No se están disparando!" They ducked for cover behind the shack's short side wall. The men inside bolted back out, weapons at the ready. Harlan quickly relocated, slipping behind thick foliage to avoid being pinned down if they sprayed bullets his way. He heard frantic Spanish. "There's a shooter! Where is he? I don't see him!" Another man roared, "Spread out! Flush him out!" Harlan smirked grimly. He'd made his point. Let them chase shadows. Cat and mouse. The four men formed a skirmish line, creeping forward, searching the undergrowth. Their rifles glinted in the sunlight. One man occasionally fired short bursts into random bushes, hoping to force out a hidden sniper. Leaves and dirt flew, but Harlan was far from their line of fire. He circled around behind them. Now the shack stood between him and them. They were moving away from the building, deeper into the jungle. The plan, it seemed, was to sweep the area, then come back. Harlan was tempted to take another shot, but he had only so many bullets, and he preferred minimal bloodshed if possible. He needed to outthink them. In the distance, he glimpsed movement on the beach. The men left behind with the boats were on alert now, scanning inland. Meanwhile, the other pair who had gone east around the rocks might be returning soon. The net was tightening. He retreated further, heading toward the rocky hills that rose behind the shack. There was an outcropping there with decent cover. From that position, he could watch the southern beach approach while staying concealed. As he moved, he laid down a fresh tripwire. If they tried to climb after him, they'd set off another rattling alarm. Nothing lethal, but enough to sow confusion. He crouched near a rock ledge, pistol in hand. Adrenaline pulsed through his veins, bringing back the old rush of a mission. He remembered telling recruits, "Cunning over brute force any day." The men fanned out below, occasionally calling to each other. They were professionals in some sense, but they lacked the discipline of a well-trained military unit. Their formation was sloppy. They argued about which direction to sweep. One guy even lit a cigarette, ignoring the risk that smoke might reveal his position. Harlan waited, silent as a snake, further up the beach. Meanwhile, the two men who'd gone east around the rocks had returned to the landing spot. Harlan watched them greet their comrades who stood guard by the boats. They conversed rapidly, gesturing inland. The men on the boats seemed agitated. Likely they'd heard the shot, or at least the echo of it. One of them, presumably in charge of this entire operation, was a tall figure with a shaved head and a scar running from brow to cheek. He wore a tactical vest bristling with ammunition. Even from a distance, Harlan could see the intensity in the man's posture. Scarface gestured for them to follow, and the group moved inland, presumably to join the search. That brought the total number of men hunting for Harlan up to 6, with 2 left behind at the boats. Harlan's vantage gave him a partial view of their approach, though he had to shift carefully to avoid exposing himself. Soon, he could see them regrouping near the shack. Scarface barked orders in a low, angry tone. Secure the perimeter. Find the shooter. Eliminate any threat. A different voice, possibly the gold-chained man, warned him the shooter seemed trained. This wasn't some random fisherman. They needed caution. Scarface responded with a string of curses, claiming they had the superior numbers and firepower. They'd flush out whoever was here and show them the Santoro cartel didn't tolerate interference. That name, Santoro, confirmed Harlan's suspicion. These men were indeed linked to a major cartel, infamous for their brutality. He suppressed a cold dread. A tense standoff. They advanced in teams of 2, sweeping carefully, searching the jungle for him. Their footsteps rustled the leaves as they advanced up the slope. Harlan flattened himself against a boulder. Any moment now, they might stumble upon his position. One pair approached a spot a few dozen yards from Harlan's vantage. The man in the lead parted the foliage with his rifle barrel. The second watched the flanks, scanning. Harlan recognized the advantage of high ground. He aimed the pistol upward, firing into the air, another warning shot designed to rattle them. The gunfire cracked through the stillness. The men dove to the ground, returning fire in Harlan's general direction. Bullets whizzed overhead, thunking into the trunk of a coconut palm behind him. One spanged off the boulder with a burst of sparks. Harlan scrambled back, avoiding the ricochet. This is not sustainable, he thought. If they pinned him down, they could flank him. The island's terrain was a double-edged sword. There were countless places to hide, but it also meant they could encircle him if he stayed in one spot too long. He slid down the far side of the rock, landing in a patch of thick vines. Gunfire barked again, chips of stone flying. The men's shouting escalated, echoing through the trees. But Harlan was already moving, weaving through the brush. He'd planned for contingencies like this. He'd set up small caches around the island. Near the cave entrance, he had a second pistol, a 9mm of lesser quality, but it might come in handy, especially if his .45 ran out of ammo. He also had to remember the rest of them. The 2 men near the boats, presumably still there, plus the ones searching the east side. In total, 8 men. Stay calm. Stick to the plan. Stay mobile. Danger at the cove. Ducking into a narrow game trail that cut across the island, Harlan headed toward the northern section where the cave lay hidden among rocky ridges. He moved quickly but quietly, mindful that others might flank him. He heard distant voices, sporadic gunfire as the search team attempted to pin him, but they had no visual. He had the advantage of infiltration training and a lifetime of combat knowledge. Finally, Harlan reached a vine-choked clearing near the edge of a cliff that overlooked a small lagoon on the island's northern side. He crouched behind a fallen palm trunk, catching his breath. The ocean breeze felt cool against his sweat-streaked face. He forced himself to think. The smugglers had arrived to set up a drug route. They intended to remain until the main shipment arrived. They wouldn't just abandon that plan. They were losing time and being harassed by an unseen opponent. This might push them to escalate. Maybe they'd call in reinforcements or radio for a bigger boat. He had to decide if he should continue a cat-and-mouse approach or attempt a direct confrontation. If he could sabotage their boats, they'd be stranded. But that also risked them going into a frenzy, scouring the island relentlessly. As he mulled his options, a sudden rustling in the undergrowth startled him. He froze, gripping his pistol. A figure emerged a few yards away, creeping with a rifle at the ready. This was one of the men, a younger guy with a slight build. He was scanning the foliage, muttering curses under his breath. He hadn't seen Harlan yet. Slowly, deliberately, Harlan pressed himself flatter against the log, controlling his breathing. If the smuggler took one step closer, they'd be nearly face to face. The man cocked his head, as if hearing something. He paused, then took a hesitant step forward. Harlan's adrenaline surged. He clutched the pistol, finger lightly on the trigger. But then, from somewhere else, a faint clink. Maybe one of Harlan's tripwire alarms got nudged by an animal or the wind. The smuggler jolted, turned toward the distant noise, and moved off that way. His footsteps grew fainter, swallowed by the jungle. Harlan exhaled. He couldn't rely on chance forever. Sabotage. Realizing direct confrontation with 8 heavily armed men wasn't wise, Harlan decided to cripple their mobility. If their boats were gone or disabled, perhaps they'd be forced to flee in any way they could. Or at least radio for a pickup that would take hours to arrive, giving him more time to strategize. He circled around the island's interior, moving with practiced stealth. Eventually, he reached the southern shoreline, concealed behind tall grass. The 2 speedboats were anchored in shallow water. 2 men remained, as expected, guarding them. From his vantage, Harlan observed them. One man leaned lazily against the bow, scanning the treeline. The other paced back and forth, occasionally shouting into a walkie-talkie, likely checking in with the search parties. To sabotage the boats, Harlan would need a distraction. Something that would lure those guards inland for just a few seconds. He studied the tide. If he could get them away from the boats, he might be able to slip into the shallows and sabotage the engines. He spotted a stray seagull perched on driftwood a short distance away. The bird fluttered off as Harlan moved closer. Carefully, he picked up a fist-sized rock. Then, aiming for a point far to the left of the guards, he hurled the rock deep into the jungle. The rustling crash among the fronds made the guards snap to attention. One shouldered his rifle, stepping forward. "Oist eso?" the man said to his partner. The other guard nodded, hesitating. After a short discussion, one guard advanced into the foliage, presumably to investigate, while the other remained closer to the boats but turned his back to the water. That was the opening Harlan needed. He slipped out from the undergrowth, gliding across the sand into the shallows. The lapping waves masked the sound of his movements. Within moments, he was crouched behind the nearest boat. The hull cast a narrow shadow. He quietly examined the engine, a powerful outboard, brand new with an external fuel line. The simplest sabotage was to slice the fuel line. He drew his combat knife, carefully reaching for the black hose that fed the engine. Suddenly, footsteps crunched on sand a few yards away. The guard who stayed behind was pacing again. Harlan paused, not even breathing, heart pounding. The guard muttered something about, "Where is he?" then resumed scanning the tree line. After a tense few seconds, the man took a few steps further. Harlan seized the moment, pressing the blade into the rubber hose, slicing a clean cut. Gasoline leaked into the water with a pungent smell. He used a piece of driftwood to wedge the cut so it looked unnoticeable at a quick glance. Then he crept to the second boat, repeating the process. He retreated into the water, chest deep, submerging to hide from sight. Through ripples, he saw the guard's boots a short distance away on the shore. Harlan inched away, heart thudding. When he'd put enough distance between himself and the vessels, he carefully resurfaced behind a large chunk of coral. The second guard had just returned from the foliage, shaking his head. They resumed their watch, unaware their boats were now effectively useless. Harlan backed away, wading deeper, then swam underwater toward a rocky promontory further down. When he finally emerged, he was out of the guard's line of sight. He dragged himself onto the beach, water dripping from his clothes. A sense of grim satisfaction bloomed in him. He had no illusions this was over. They still had numbers, guns, possibly a radio to call for backup. But now, if they tried to flee or bring in reinforcements with these boats, they'd find themselves stranded. Discovery. It wasn't long before the men realized something was amiss. Harlan had circled back inland, intending to find a vantage where he could wait out the confusion. He heard angry shouts in Spanish from the direction of the boats. A brief volley of gunfire crackled. Perhaps they thought they saw him. Then, over the next hour, the smugglers regrouped. Harlan kept his distance, watching from concealment in the thick brush. They gathered near the shack, exasperated. There were curses about the freaking old man who was messing with them. A few men advocated for burning down the entire island's vegetation to smoke him out. Scarface, the tall man with the tactical vest, berated them in a controlled fury. "Stop shooting into the jungle randomly. We'll waste ammo. We need to find him, then kill him." One of the others retorted, "The boats have been sabotaged. We can't even start them. Fuel lines are cut. We're stranded." That escalated tensions. Harlan listened, silent as a ghost. Scarface forced the men to calm down and ordered them to search methodically. He also told them to fix the boats if they could. A burly man with some mechanical skill headed to the beach, cursing. The rest split into pairs again. Harlan was satisfied to see the seeds of fear creeping into their demeanor. They'd come expecting to find a docile old occupant, if at all. Instead, they'd stumbled onto a cunning adversary who knew every inch of the terrain. Still, Harlan knew they might eventually corner him. They weren't incompetent. They had enough manpower to fan out. Sooner or later, they'd call for help on their radios, or a bigger shipment boat might arrive, suspecting something had gone wrong. He needed a new plan. Possibly, he could pick them off one by one, or find a way to herd them onto a part of the island where they could be contained. But that risked violence. Harlan's jaw set. He'd do what he must, but he wouldn't relish the killing. Old man's resolve. As late afternoon shadows lengthened, the men systematically combed the island. Harlan watched from a perch high up in a coconut palm. He'd climbed it to get a better view. From this vantage, he saw them branching into different directions. They advanced slowly, scanning with rifles raised. He made a mental note of each pair's route. One pair was heading toward the northern lagoon, near the cave. Another two circled the central area. Scarface and Gold Chain stuck close together, searching near the shack and up the slope behind it. One pair was unaccounted for, likely near the beach trying to repair the boats. Harlan considered each group. He'd prefer to isolate them. The duo heading for the northern lagoon could be a target. The caves there provided a labyrinth of stone passages, some partially collapsed. If he could lure them inside, he might be able to knock them out or trap them, at least. He slid down the palm tree, landing lightly on the ground. Then he skirted around the main paths, heading north. He arrived at the lagoon area in under 10 minutes, moving swiftly. The pair of smugglers was just entering the rocky terrain near the cave mouth. One had a shotgun, the other an assault rifle. Plan formed. Harlan crept around to the far side of the cave entrance, careful not to dislodge any pebbles. Inside was darkness, but further in, there was a smaller exit that opened onto a narrow ledge. He could use that to slip out if needed. He paused by the entrance, concealed behind a boulder, waiting. The men approached, murmuring to each other. They likely wanted to check if the old man hid inside. The first man, the one with the assault rifle, poked his head in. "Esta adentro?" he called, voice echoing. The second man hovered at the entrance, shotgun at the ready. Harlan, crouched behind the boulder just inside the cave, let them step deeper. 10 seconds passed. The men's flashlight beams danced across the damp stone walls, revealing broken stalactites and shallow pools. They were about 5 or 6 steps in, heads turned as they scanned. Harlan sprang into motion, silent as a wraith. He lunged at the shotgun wielder from behind, hooking an arm around the man's neck, pressing the muzzle of his pistol into his side. "Drop your weapon," Harlan hissed in Spanish, voice low. The man froze, eyes wide. The other smuggler whipped around, but Harlan pulled the pinned man around as a human shield, pressing the pistol to his ribs. "I said drop your weapon," Harlan repeated, more forceful. The second man hesitated, assault rifle trembling. He stared at his comrade, who nodded frantically. Slowly, the man lowered the rifle. Harlan kicked it aside, deeper into a dark crevice. "You try anything," Harlan warned, "and he's dead." The pinned smuggler's breath came in short gasps. Harlan felt the man's heart hammering under his arm. He had no desire to kill this man unless forced. The second smuggler swore under his breath. In broken English, he said, You can't escape. We have more men. You stand no chance." Harlan's voice was a quiet thunder. "Then call them off. Tell them to leave my island." A flicker of confusion crossed the man's face. We can't. They'll kill us for failing." Harlan's jaw clenched. He glanced down at the pinned man, noticing fear in his eyes. "Then you'll get no sympathy from me." He slammed the butt of his pistol into the pinned man's temple, a controlled blow to knock him unconscious. The man went limp, sagging in Harlan's grip. The second smuggler gaped, half rising as if to intervene. Harlan swung the pistol, but again, catching him on the side of the head. The man collapsed with a grunt, eyes rolling back. Both men were down. Quickly, Harlan checked for pulses. They were alive. Good. He dragged them deeper into the cave, retrieving their weapons. The assault rifle was an M4 variant, well maintained. The shotgun was a semi-auto model. He found extra ammo in their vests. He used a coil of rope from a stash in the cave to tie their hands behind their backs and secure their ankles. Then he gagged them with strips of cloth, leaving them in a side tunnel. They'd be unconscious for a while, but even if they woke up, they'd remain tethered. That left 6 men still active. Harlan moved swiftly, checking his watch. Late afternoon. The sky outside was tinted with the first hints of dusk. He dreaded the idea of nighttime warfare, but it might work in his favor. He'd have better stealth. He took the assault rifle, having greater range and capacity than his pistol. He slung it over his shoulder, double-checking the chamber. Then, leaving the 2 incapacitated men behind, he slipped out of the cave's hidden exit, determined to continue his silent war. Gathering storm. Back at the shack area, Scarface and Gold Chain discovered the sabotage was more extensive than they'd hoped. The boat guard with mechanical knowledge had tried patching the fuel lines, but they'd lost a large quantity of gasoline. They had only a spare jerry can of fuel, not enough for both engines. Worse, with the lines so thoroughly slashed, there was no guarantee they could keep the engines going for more than a few minutes. They realized they needed a new plan. Possibly they could radio for rescue. Harlan watched them from the dense brush near the treeline. He couldn't hear every word, but from snatches of conversation, he gathered they were indeed trying to contact their bigger vessel or a base on the mainland. At one point, Scarface barked into his walkie-talkie, "We have a hostile occupant, possibly ex-military. We can't secure the island alone. Need backup." Static crackled, but no clear reply. Maybe the island's geography or the distance from the mainland hindered their signal, or their contact was simply out of range. The men's frustration built. Harlan could see them pacing, glancing nervously at the jungle. They'd lost 2 men. At least they'd discovered that pair was missing. Another 4 were exhausted, having trekked around the island fruitlessly. Gunfire had wasted some ammo. They had to suspect the old man was systematically picking them off. Gold Chain muttered something about, "We have to find those 2. If they're dead." Scarface turned, face contorted. "Then we kill this old man. We burn everything." Harlan's eyes narrowed. He recognized the mania in Scarface's voice. If cornered, these men would do anything. The sun dipped lower. Harlan resolved to continue the fight by stealth at night. He'd hamper them until they had no choice but to abandon the mission or find themselves in a dire position. He slipped away, deciding it was time to relocate to a safer vantage. The sky bled red and purple over the ocean, and the palm trees cast long shadows across the sand. Nightfall. Darkness fell quickly. The island's nights could be pitch black when the moon was new or hidden behind clouds. That evening, a thin crescent moon provided some pale illumination, but it was dim enough to make the jungle a maze of black silhouettes. Harlan moved with practiced ease, used to the island's terrain. He had scouted every route, every rock. He rarely needed a flashlight, especially not now when stealth was paramount. The smugglers, however, flicked on flashlights and headlamps. In the distance, beams of white light cut through the darkness, bobbing as the men walked. He heard them curse occasionally, stumbling over roots or tangling in vines. From his vantage near a rocky ridge, Harlan noted their attempts to form a makeshift camp near the shack. He saw a flicker of a campfire or lantern, though they quickly tried to cover it with a tarp to avoid giving away their position. They were likely trying to rest in shifts, but fear had them tense. He realized the moral weight of the situation. These men were criminals, smugglers working for a ruthless cartel. They would kill him without hesitation if they got the chance. But they were still human beings, some likely forced into this life by circumstance. Harlan reminded himself that if he showed mercy, it could cost him his life. He was too old to outrun bullets, but maybe he could keep them off balance until they gave up. Night raid. Close to midnight, Harlan decided on another strike. Moving through a route that skirted the western beach, he approached the men's makeshift camp. The trees were thick here, and the smugglers' lamps cast flickering shadows. He counted 4 men present: Scarface, Gold Chain, and 2 others. The remaining pair might be patrolling the perimeter or off in the jungle. He crept closer. At the edge of the trees, he paused behind a trunk. He could smell the faint odor of cigarettes and cheap liquor. They were passing around a flask. Gold Chain said something about sunrise. Scarface retorted that if backup didn't come by then, they'd search the entire island again. One of the other men nodded, lamenting their situation. Their rifles rested nearby, within arm's reach but not held at the ready. Their guard was partially down. Harlan considered lobbing a rock or making a noise to get them to separate. If he could isolate 1 or 2, he might tie them up like the others. But there was a risk. He looked beyond them to the shack. The door was open, a lantern inside revealing scattered items. His meager possessions tossed around as the men had searched. A pang of anger flickered in him. He scanned the perimeter. That's when he noticed a figure about 30 yards off, hidden among the trees, presumably a lookout. The lookout was scanning with a flashlight, though not very diligently. Harlan decided on a simpler tactic. If he fired a few shots from the darkness, they'd panic. He could then vanish again. Repeated psychological pressure might break their spirits. He quietly unslung the M4, resting it on a low branch for stability. He had a limited magazine, 20-something rounds left in this one. He flicked the selector switch to semi-auto. He aimed at a patch of ground near the campfire, squeezed the trigger. Pop, pop, pop. Bullets whistled into the sand, sending sparks and puffs of earth. The men jolted up, scrambling for their rifles, shouting. The lookout spun, swinging the flashlight wildly. Harlan fired another trio of rounds near the lookout's feet. The man cursed, diving behind a tree. In the chaos, a few wild shots were fired back in Harlan's general direction. He was already ducking low, changing position behind the trunk. Bullets slapped into nearby bark with dull thuds. "Red errata!" someone yelled. "Get cover!" Harlan crawled away, circling around to the left. The flashlights were pointing in random directions, searching for any trace of him. Gunfire continued sporadically, muzzle flashes lighting up the trees. He heard Scarface bellow, "Stay together! Don't shoot each other!" Shouts and confusion reigned. Harlan popped out from behind a different trunk, fired a few more rounds over their heads, then vanished again. He moved deeper into the darkness, heart pounding. He realized with grim satisfaction that he was slowly wearing them down. Anxiety, fatigue, confusion, they could unravel even tough criminals. A haunting thought. Eventually, the gunfire died down, and the night became eerily quiet. Harlan holed up in a small hollow at the base of a large banyan tree, half buried in thick vines. He listened. The men were likely regrouping again, possibly patrolling in pairs. He considered his next steps. There was a real chance that, in desperation, they'd burn the foliage or blow something up. But hopefully, they'd realize that would trap them here as well, with no easy escape. He knew one thing for certain. Once dawn broke, they'd have a better chance of spotting him. He needed to reduce their numbers further or convince them to flee by sunrise. He considered the possibility that the larger shipment boat might arrive at dawn. If that happened, he'd be outnumbered by a larger force. We can't have that. A cold resolve settled in him. If it came down to a final confrontation, he'd use lethal force. He'd done everything possible to scare them away without piling up bodies. But if they insisted on taking this island from him, he'd do what a Marine must do. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the night breeze on his cheek. The flicker of old regrets whispered through his mind. Things he'd done in the Corps, men he'd lost, decisions he still questioned. But his moral compass pointed true. He was protecting his home, his sanctuary. This wasn't senseless violence. Steeling himself, he prepared to move again. Dawn's approach. The darkest hour just before dawn found Harlan perched atop a rocky outcrop near the island's central ridge. He'd chosen this spot because it gave him a vantage over much of the shoreline. The ocean stretched endlessly, faint starlight dancing on the gentle waves. He sensed dawn was near. A faint grayness tinged the eastern sky. Below, in a clearing near the shack, the smugglers had circled the wagons, so to speak. They'd formed a rough perimeter with 1 or 2 men on guard while the others tried to rest. Harlan counted 5 men visible. That meant 1 pair was still missing in action, the pair in the cave, and that accounted for 7 total. He'd dealt with 2 in the cave, so that left exactly 5 on the field. That was consistent. He watched them through the M4's iron sights. Their shoulders were slumped, exhausted. Some leaned against tree trunks, eyelids drooping. Scarface, however, was prowling like a caged tiger. He looked furious. Then, from the corner of his eye, Harlan spotted a faint light far out at sea, a flicker that could be the running lights of a larger vessel. His heart rate spiked. Was that the incoming shipment boat? Or was it a coastal patrol vessel? He peered carefully. The light seemed too bright to be a small fishing boat. It moved steadily, heading in a path that might intersect with the island. The smugglers noticed it as well. Scarface and Gold Chain rose, pointing and muttering. Scarface spoke into a walkie-talkie again. Harlan couldn't hear the exchange, but it was likely them trying to signal the approaching craft. Tension coiled in Harlan's stomach. If that was indeed the cartel's supply ship, a new wave of gunmen or contraband might soon land, overwhelming him. On the other hand, if it was the Coast Guard, the smugglers might panic. Either way, dawn was creeping up. The final showdown was at hand. Harlan gripped the M4, exhaling a silent breath. He'd stand his ground. This was his island. He wasn't leaving. Let them come. As the sky begins to brighten and that mysterious vessel draws closer, Harlan realizes the fate of the island, and his own life, may hinge on what happens in the next few hours. Will he find a way to outmaneuver the smugglers one last time? Or will the arrival of a potentially larger force seal his doom? Part 2. Dawn whispered along the horizon, painting the sky in bands of muted pink and pale gold. Harlan Finch remained crouched in the scrub near the rocky ridge, eyes fixed on the mysterious vessel approaching from the southeast. Through the lingering darkness, he could see navigation lights bobbing on the water. Occasionally, he thought he glimpsed the silhouette of a larger hull, though it was too distant to identify clearly. Down below, the smugglers stirred like restless shadows. The precarious hours of the night had worn them thin with anxiety and fatigue. With 2 of their people taken out of commission, though not killed, and at least 1 more hidden somewhere on the perimeter, they had to function under the assumption that Harlan could appear from any angle. Their makeshift camp by the shack was disheveled, riddled with bullet casings and footprints. A faint flicker of their campfire remained, now mostly ash and embers. But at first light, the men moved with renewed determination. Harlan scanned them through the M4's iron sights. He saw Scarface, tall, muscled, and radiating fury, talking to Gold Chain, who looked agitated and pale around the eyes. 2 others hovered near them, shoulders hunched, rifles slung at the ready. Some distant memory in Harlan's mind labeled their posture as dangerous cornered animal. They might lash out in any direction if he pushed too hard. He turned his gaze back to the sea. That vessel was definitely headed for the island. Each passing minute, the shape grew clearer, a mid-sized cargo trawler or perhaps a converted fishing vessel. Traveled slowly, more like it was scanning for reefs than simply passing by. Harlan's stomach twisted with an uneasy suspicion. This was no Coast Guard patrol. It had the purposeful, hulking silhouette of a smuggler's supply ship. The muzzle of the M4 felt cold under his palm, reminding him of the day's grim possibilities. If they bring more men, he thought, or heavier weapons. He took a measured breath, recalling that old Marine Corps mantra: adapt, improvise, overcome. He might not have a radio or an ally, but he did have the island. And the island, with all its hidden crags and thick foliage, was an extension of him now, a foreboding arrival. By the time the sun's first rays broke over the horizon, the vessel had anchored in deeper water off the southeastern reef. Harlan, perched in a cluster of rocks near a high vantage, squinted into the rising light. The ship was large enough to carry a dozen or more men plus contraband. Even from this distance, he could see some dark figures on the deck. He noticed sudden commotion in the smugglers' camp below. Scarface and Gold Chain rushed to a vantage point of their own, just beyond the shack, where they could see the incoming ship. They seemed elated. The rescue or reinforcement they'd been hoping for was finally in sight. "Mira, ahivinen," Scarface told one of his men, gesturing. "At last," he said in English, loud enough that Harlan could catch the word on the breeze. "We'll get the help we need." Harlan's mind churned. If that boat disgorged 10 or 15 more smugglers, he'd be outnumbered to a point where no amount of traps or stealth would save him. Unless a bold idea formed: sabotage them at the beach again or intercept them before they could properly land. He eyed the southwestern cove where the two smaller speedboats were still anchored, half repaired. The men had tried to patch the fuel lines, but they lacked enough spare gas to run both engines at full capacity. Perhaps they wanted to transfer new fuel from the bigger ship. Across the beach, the men began gathering what gear they had, presumably to greet the arrival of their allies. Harlan guessed they'd either row a smaller skiff from the big ship to shore or anchor close enough to offload. No matter what, the only feasible landing spot for a larger vessel was the southern or southeastern beach, the same area Harlan had repeatedly sabotaged. He retreated from his vantage, deciding that if he were going to take decisive action, now was the time. But he had to move quickly and choose his battles carefully. The island, for all its intricacies, wasn't so large that a swarm of armed men couldn't corner him eventually. 2. Combat Instructor's Gambit. Harlan circled the northern edge of the island, crossing familiar game trails in the dim morning light. He kept the M4 slung over his shoulder, scanning for any of the smuggler patrols that might still roam the interior. Now that daybreak revealed all, stealth would be harder. He passed the mouth of the cave where he had tied up the two unconscious men. With silent caution, he peered inside. The interior was dark, touched by watery echoes. He tiptoed along the edge of the main cavern, glancing at the side tunnel. The men were still there, bound and gagged, newly awake but unable to free themselves. One gave a muffled groan upon seeing Harlan's silhouette. The other glared. Harlan took a moment to confirm the ropes were still tight. Neither man was in immediate danger. They were just immobilized. He crouched beside them, speaking in a hushed tone of Spanish. "I won't kill you if you stay put. Your friends have reinforcements coming, but it won't help you unless you behave." They could only stare, frustration evident in their expressions. Harlan rose and slipped out without further comment. In the hush of the cave, echoes of dripping water followed him. Reminders that even stone can be worn down by time. That was how he intended to wear down the smugglers, slow, methodical pressure. He resumed his trek toward the southern beaches. A desperate phone call. Morning light spread across the island, revealing the full scope of the smugglers' hustle. Down on the southern shoreline, the large vessel was maneuvering awkwardly just beyond the reef, searching for a safe channel. Harlan found cover behind a curtain of sea grape bushes near a rocky outcrop. From there, he could see the shoreline sloping gently into turquoise water. A smaller dinghy descended from the ship's side, manned by two figures wearing baseball caps. One carried what looked like a portable radio case. They headed for shore, the outboard motor sputtering. On land, Scarface paced with the walkie-talkie in hand, calling out instructions in Spanish. Gold Chain stood next to him, scanning the treeline nervously. The other two men, since two more were still out searching or on guard, hung back by the partially beached speedboats. Harlan noticed Scarface kept glancing around, as though expecting an ambush. They're more alert now, he mused. No easy distractions this time. Within minutes, the dinghy crunched onto the sand. The pair who arrived stepped out with quick strides, exchanging tense handshakes with Scarface. One of them wore a black ballistic vest with a white patch that read, Policia, a stolen vest, no doubt. The other looked older, with graying stubble on his jaw. Both carried sidearms on their belts. Conversation flew fast, loud enough that Harlan could catch bits and pieces. We brought some supplies, but the boat can't anchor close until the tide is higher. We didn't expect trouble. Boss is furious. Where's your radio? And why are we just hearing about this now? Scarface gestured angrily. We have an old man on this island who fights like a damned commando. Then Scarface spat on the sand. He sabotaged our boats, took out two of our men, maybe more. Harlan could see the new arrivals glancing around, measuring the surroundings with cautious eyes. It was clear they hadn't anticipated a serious threat. Then the older one, the stubbly man, barked, "Get the rest of the gear from the ship. We have to move fast." Scarface pointed at the horizon, responding, "We can't bring the big ship too close. Shoals are everywhere. High tide or not, it's risky. We'll ferry the cargo by dinghy." The men parted ways, one returning to the dinghy to relay orders. Scarface and the older new arrival conferred quickly, stepping aside from the group. Harlan's breath came slow and steady, heart pumping. He readjusted his vantage, noticing the M4 felt heavier now. If they ferried a dozen more men, he wouldn't stand a chance in a direct confrontation. But if he could hamper the ferry process, maybe keep them from unloading major reinforcements, that might force them to retreat. The net tightens. The notion of confronting them right here on the beach whispered temptation into Harlan's mind. He had the advantage of surprise again, but there were now at least 6 men in sight, plus 2 or 3 patrolling, plus whoever was on the vessel waiting. He decided to wait for an opening. The dinghy, weighed down by small crates, was returning from the ship. Another pair of men in mismatched tactical gear hopped out, each armed with submachine guns. Immediately, they scanned the treeline with suspicious eyes. No question now, a paramilitary element had arrived. Scarface assembled them near the speedboats, pointing to the battered hulls. Harlan overheard him say, "We need these engines fixed, or we're sitting ducks. The old man, he's out there." He gestured at the thick vegetation. "He might have more traps." One of the paramilitary men scoffed. "You're telling me you let some single old hermit do this?" Scarface bristled. Gold Chain retorted angrily, "He's not just some fisherman. He's trained, possibly ex-military. Has us pinned." The paramilitary men exchanged glances. One shrugged. "We'll find him. You said there are only a handful of places to hide, right?" Gold Chain let out a sardonic laugh. "There are dozens of hideouts. The island might be small, but it's got caves, thick brush, rocky ridges. He knows every inch. We do not. That gave the newcomers pause. They began conferring in low tones. Harlan felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and dread. They respected the challenge, which meant they'd proceed carefully and more effectively. As the morning wore on, the group consolidated, sharing ammunition, handing out more powerful firearms from the crates they'd brought. Harlan spotted at least 2 AR-style rifles among them, plus extra magazines. At this rate, they could quickly saturate the island with more men, possibly outflank him. He had to act soon, making a decision. It was time for a direct blow, something that would either deter them or force them to retreat back to the ship. Harlan mulled over the plan. Take out the dinghy. If he disabled the small boat ferrying supplies and men, the big ship couldn't easily offload or retrieve them. It would leave the smugglers stranded again, facing only partial reinforcements. With quiet steps, he withdrew from his vantage, circling inland until he reached a hidden path that opened onto the eastern side of the southern beach. From that angle, he could approach the dinghy from the side, possibly unseen. He moved fast. His heart hammered, but a lifetime of discipline kept his thoughts organized. He recalled each detail of the terrain: a ridge of rock shaped like a crooked spine, a cluster of driftwood near the shoreline. He'd used those landmarks during earlier scouting missions. After 10 minutes of stealthy trekking, he emerged behind a thick cluster of sea grape and spiky shrubs. Now, only about 50 yards of open sand and scattered palm stumps separated him from the dinghy. He could see half a dozen men near the speedboats. 2 of them fiddled with the engines, apparently trying to fix the sabotage. 2 more kept watch, scanning with rifles. Scarface and Gold Chain were conferring with the older newcomer. The second paramilitary man, stubble-faced, wearing the militia vest, was missing, likely patrolling the perimeter. The dinghy itself lay about 20 yards from the group, partially afloat, its bow resting in shallow water. A crate of gear sat inside. All right, Harlan thought, adjusting his M4. Strike quickly, then vanish. He took aim at the outboard motor of the dinghy. He inhaled, braced the rifle, and squeezed the trigger. Crack, crack, crack. 3 shots. Metal sparked and clattered. The motor's casing shattered and the dinghy jolted sideways in the shallows. Water gushed in where bullets had punched holes. Instantly, the smugglers spun, yelling. "Fuego!" someone screamed. They blasted rounds at the foliage, muzzle flashes ripping the morning air. Harlan dove behind the trunk of a fallen palm, pressing himself flat as bullets whined overhead. He heard Scarface bellow a furious curse. Another volley of gunfire peppered the sea grape leaves, shattering branches. Sand kicked up in bursts. Harlan crawled sideways, still behind cover, then scrambled further inland. He popped up from a new angle, firing 2 more rounds into the dinghy's hull. The rubber sides deflated with a hiss. Water poured in. One of the paramilitary men returned fire, short bursts that stung the air. Harlan ducked, heart in his throat. The velocity and intensity of gunfire was far higher than before. These men weren't novices with sloppy technique. They laid down covering fire while one of them tried to flank. But Harlan anticipated that. He retreated along a curved path behind a stand of palms, weaving past vines. A few bullets tore into palm trunks behind him, sending jagged splinters into the humid air. Within seconds, Harlan was gone, vanished into the thick underbrush. Consequences of the raid. From a new hiding spot, a small hollow behind a basalt boulder, Harlan watched the aftermath. The smugglers realized the dinghy was wrecked, the outboard shot. Scarface kicked at the remains in frustration, shouting that the old man had crippled their reinforcements again. The older newcomer clenched his jaw. He whipped out a radio, barking a message to whoever was still on the large ship. In Spanish, he said, "We'll need to circle in closer or find a second skiff. Bring more men if you have to, or else we'll never get a foothold here." Harlan felt a swirl of tension. If the larger ship risked coming nearer to the reef, it might run aground, but if they managed to navigate carefully, they could anchor closer. I need to keep them from establishing a landing, Harlan thought grimly. He also heard the paramilitary men discuss searching the entire island systematically. They'd lost their easy method of ferrying supplies, but they still had enough guns and bodies. With the boat disabled on the beach, their only short-term solution was to track Harlan down. They couldn't leave the island so easily. They divided up again. 4 men would guard the beach and the disabled dinghy, while 3 others plus Scarface would do a final sweep of the interior. Harlan noted they were leaving Gold Chain behind to supervise repairs to the speedboats, a sign that Scarface trusted him for that logistical chore. As they began fanning out, Harlan realized the net was closing. They'd comb every corner. A confrontation seemed inevitable. Running skirmishes. The morning advanced with slow inevitability, the sun rising higher, the heat intensifying. Harlan used the island's terrain to stay one step ahead of the search teams. They crisscrossed the interior, calling out to one another with short, clipped phrases. He occasionally glimpsed them in the distance, rifles and gear glinting in the sunlight. Each time they drew close, he crept away, employing the same infiltration tactics he had once taught recruits, keeping low, stepping where the ground was soft, avoiding sudden movements in open areas. Twice, he heard a twig snap under a smuggler's foot and realized they were only yards away. Each time, he hid behind thick vegetation until they moved on. But with every passing hour, the men grew more organized, moving in pairs with overlapping fields of fire. The paramilitary newcomers took the lead, while Scarface and 2 of his original crew followed behind. The older stubble-faced man in the militia vest clearly had some training. He directed them with hand signals, scanned vantage points, and occasionally paused to check footprints or disturbed brush. Harlan knew they'd eventually track him down if he only ran. So he set small diversions, bits of tripwire attached to tin cans, or lines that, when pulled, sent a rock tumbling through brush on the opposite side of the path. These minor ruses slowed the searchers down, keeping them guessing. Gunfire occasionally erupted when they mistook a rattling can for Harlan. Still, the tension ratcheted higher each time bullets cracked the air. Harlan's ammunition supply was limited. He had the M4's partial mag, plus his .45 pistol with a few spare magazines. If they pinned him in a firefight, he wouldn't last. Voices in the jungle. By midday, the sun blazed overhead, sweat-soaking Harlan's shirt. He'd taken refuge near a trickling freshwater spring hidden in a dense patch of ferns. He scooped a handful of water to his lips, trying to stay hydrated. He heard footsteps approaching, 2 men conversing in agitated Spanish. Quickly, he ducked behind the ferns, holding his breath. "This old man is a ghost," one complained. "I've been on missions in the mountains that were easier than this." The other responded with a snarl, "If we don't catch him, the boss will feed us to the sharks. We promised the island would be secured." They wandered past, rifles at the ready, stepping carefully around a boulder. Harlan stayed still, barely breathing. The men paused at the edge of the clearing. One wiped sweat from his brow. What if he has more men hidden somewhere? The first man wondered aloud. "We only see him alone, but The second man cut him off. "We'd have found them by now. He's solo. Just a demon of a soldier." Finally, they moved on, cursing the heat. Their footsteps receded into the jungle. Harlan exhaled shakily, letting the tension drain. This cat-and-mouse game couldn't continue forever. Eventually, they'll corner me or I'll force them off. He drank another palmful of water, then quietly slithered away in the opposite direction. Allies or intruders? As the afternoon stretched on, Harlan glimpsed more activity near the shoreline. The large smuggler vessel, a converted trawler he could now see clearly, was inching dangerously close to the reef, apparently trying to find a deeper channel. Small waves broke against its hull in pearly foam. If they managed to anchor in a spot with stable depth, they could lower another skiff or even swim cargo to shore. Near the beach, Harlan could see the remaining men scurrying about, building some form of improvised ramp or platform from driftwood. Possibly they wanted to set up a staging area for the contraband. It all pointed to one conclusion: they intended to make this island a permanent hub for their smuggling route, no matter the cost. Harlan felt anger smolder in his chest. This was his sanctuary, his final retreat from a life of violence, and they wanted to corrupt it into a transshipment point for drugs and guns. He wouldn't let that happen if it cost him everything. He wondered if he could signal the Coast Guard somehow, but he had no working long-range radio. Flares, yes, but the smugglers would shoot him before letting him send up a distress signal. He weighed another option: if the trawler beached itself or got stuck on the reef, that might buy time. But gambling on that was risky. Return to the shack. Eventually, Harlan made his way around the island's perimeter to the northwest side, where a short slope led back down toward his shack. He needed more supplies, particularly water and a bit of food, before nightfall. Surviving a second night of cat and mouse in this heat on an empty stomach would be tough. He crept carefully, mindful of the guards who might have stationed themselves around the shack. From a distance, he saw that the structure was still standing, though one wall looked scorched or blackened near the corner. Perhaps the smugglers had tried to set a small fire to drive him out. Thankfully, it hadn't spread beyond that. He counted 2 men outside. They sat near the shack's front, weapons across their laps, scanning the jungle. They looked sweaty, exhausted, and bored, but still dangerous. With caution, Harlan decided to circle to the shack's rear, where a battered wooden ladder led to a raised platform. It was a spot he used for storing fishing nets and drying racks. If he could slip in quietly, maybe he could grab at least a little food or his hidden canteens. He crawled through thick brush until he was only a few yards from the shack's back wall. He paused, listening to the men's conversation. "Why are we even here still? The others should have caught him by now. Boss says we wait. Either they flush him out or we spot him trying to sneak in." One man sighed. "He's old. He can't keep this up forever." Harlan knew he had to act silently. He couldn't risk a firefight with 2 armed men in open space. Distraction, he thought. Give them something to investigate somewhere else. He carefully dug a small rock from the ground, feeling its weight. Then he chucked it side-armed into the jungle to the left of the shack. The rustling impact caused the men to jolt upright. One sprang to his feet, rifle ready. The other rose more cautiously. "Did you hear that?" the first demanded. "Yeah," the second hissed, stepping off the shack's porch, eyes narrowed. "Let's check it out." They crept toward the noise, rifles up, scanning. Harlan used the moment to slip around the back corner. He climbed the ladder with practiced stealth, grateful it didn't creak too loudly. Reaching the small wooden platform, he pressed himself flat. From there, he eased through a half-broken window into his shack. The interior was dim, strewn with debris from the smugglers' earlier searches. They had overturned his small table, scattered dried herbs, rummaged through his meager belongings. The stink of smoke lingered from the partial burning. Harlan quickly located a sack of dried fish that they'd tossed aside. He found his metal water canteen lying on the floor, still about half full. He gulped down several swigs, then refilled it from a hidden rain-catch barrel that had miraculously survived near the kitchen corner. The water was stale but drinkable. He felt a pang seeing the mess. This was his home, ransacked. Anger flared, but he tamped it down. Survival first. Justice would come later. He packed a small cloth bag with a handful of dried fish strips, 2 coconuts from a basket in the corner, and whatever was left of his meager supplies. Then he heard the men's voices again. "Nothing here? Must have been an animal. Well, we can't both be away from the shack. Come on." They were returning. Harlan froze, searching for an escape route that wouldn't put him face to face with them. The front door was out. The window he'd come through faced their approach. He spotted an alternative, a hole in the shack floor near the corner, a trap door he'd built in case of storms. It dropped below the shack onto the sandy ground, hidden by driftwood planks. Without hesitation, he slid through it, landing silently in a crouch on the shady side. He crawled behind the shack, clenching his bag of supplies. Carefully, he peered around the corner. The 2 men had just stepped back onto the porch. One was complaining about the heat while the other scowled at the treeline. Harlan exhaled, creeping away. He'd secured enough to keep going. A chance encounter. He slipped along a narrow path that skirted a rocky cliff overlooking the western lagoon. Each step was cautious, but his mind whirred with next steps: disable any more dinghies. Track the movement of that trawler. Keep them from fully landing. Suddenly, he heard a voice behind him, a whisper, alto. "Stop. He spun, M4 raised, only to see a single smuggler about 20 feet behind him. The man wore the militia vest, stubble across his jaw, and he was leveling a sidearm, some type of 9mm pistol, straight at Harlan. For a split second, neither moved. The paramilitary man's face was smeared with dirt and tension radiated through his stance. Harlan's heart slammed against his ribcage. "Drop it," the man ordered in rough English. "Or I shoot." Harlan's grip tightened on the M4. They were at near point-blank range. Even if Harlan tried to pivot and fire, the man might get a shot off first. He stared into the paramilitary man's eyes, seeing not just hostility but something else, a glimmer of respect or perhaps a steeled resolve to end this. "Drop it," the man repeated, stepping closer. A swirl of old Marine instincts rose within Harlan. He measured angles, stances, the possibility of disarming him. "He's got a pistol. I've got a rifle." At this range, either of them could land a lethal shot in the blink of an eye. But Harlan saw the man's left foot planted awkwardly on the slope's edge. Perhaps a quick feint might unbalance him. The paramilitary man's brow furrowed. He demanded in Spanish, "Rifle on the ground, hands where I can see them." Harlan slowly lowered the muzzle, letting the rifle dip. He kept his eyes on the man's hands. The second the paramilitary man relaxed his aim, Harlan dropped to one knee, pivoting sideways in a single fluid motion, and swung the rifle butt up, batting the man's pistol aside. "Blam!" The pistol fired, the bullet zipping past Harlan's shoulder. Harlan sprang forward, smashing the man's forearm with the rifle stock, forcing the gun out of his hand. The man snarled, swinging a fist. Harlan ducked, ramming his elbow into the paramilitary man's ribcage. The man staggered, but he was no pushover. He lunged back, hooking an arm around Harlan's shoulder, trying to throw him off balance. They tumbled sideways into the dusty path. The M4 clattered from Harlan's grip, landing a few feet away. Both men scrambled to reach their weapons, but the paramilitary man twisted, hooking Harlan's leg. Harlan drove a knee into the man's stomach. He felt muscle and bone yield slightly under the impact. The man growled, pushing off. In the scramble, Harlan seized the advantage. He grabbed his combat knife from the sheath on his thigh, brandishing the blade. The paramilitary man's eyes widened and he tried to backpedal. Harlan's voice came out low, controlled. "Don't," he warned. The paramilitary man paused, chest heaving. His pistol lay 3 feet away in the dirt, out of immediate reach. The M4 was also out of Harlan's grasp. They were at a deadlock, each able to lunge for a weapon, but only if they risked the other's next move. "You're good," the man panted, a grudging respect in his tone. "Better than us, apparently." "You're trespassing," Harlan said coldly. "Leave." The man spat a fleck of blood onto the ground. "If I did, Santoro would kill me. This job is do or die." Harlan's jaw clenched. He heard faint voices in the distance, likely more smugglers, possibly drawn by the gunshot. No time, he thought. In a lightning move, he feinted a slash at the man's chest. The paramilitary man dodged, arms up, and Harlan slammed a kick into the man's side, sending him tumbling down the rocky slope toward some thick brush. The man twisted mid-fall, grabbing at branches, but gravity pulled him. He crashed into the undergrowth, rolling. Harlan seized the moment to grab the M4 and the man's pistol. Then he sprinted away, ignoring the man's groan from below. He had no wish to kill if it could be helped, but he couldn't remain. Reinforcements would converge on the shot. He had to vanish again, bleeding them of time and morale. Gathering clouds. He retreated to a high vantage on the island's western ridge, panting, sweat pouring off him. His pulse thundered in his ears. This was the closest he'd come to being caught. "They're stepping up their game," he acknowledged. From that ridge, he had a partial view of the sea. The sky was now bright, but clouds clustered on the horizon, puffy white turning to gray, hinting a possible afternoon storm. The big smuggler trawler still lingered beyond the reef, shifting slightly with the tide. Harlan watched with grim attention as more activity unfolded. He saw at least one new small boat, smaller than the original dinghy, lowered from the trawler's side. Perhaps they had a spare. As it touched the water, a couple of men hopped in, testing the outboard. This was bad news. They were determined to land more people and cargo. Sure enough, the new skiff began approaching the island, albeit slowly, picking a path through the reef. Harlan counted at least 4 men aboard, maybe 5. They wore dark clothing, some with ballistic vests. Each carried rifles or submachine guns. Below, Scarface and Gold Chain regrouped near the beach, calling out to the others scattered inland. Harlan could barely make out Scarface's shout, "We've got a second boat coming, hurry back." One by one, the search teams broke off their inland patrols to converge on the shoreline, presumably to coordinate with the newly arriving reinforcements. Harlan's gaze darted around. He saw men emerging from the jungle, some wearing paramilitary gear, some in ragged t-shirts. They formed a cluster of about 6 or 7 near the water, plus the 4 or 5 on the skiff. That meant they'd have around 10 or 12 on the ground if the new skiff landed successfully, and that was assuming no one else was still hidden inland. Meanwhile, 2 were tied up in the cave, and Harlan had injured or at least delayed the militia vest man. Still, the numbers weren't in Harlan's favor. He considered trying to snipe the skiff from here, but it was a long shot with an M4 and iron sights, plus he didn't have unlimited ammo. "I need a more cunning plan." Seeds of chaos. Suddenly, the sky rumbled, a low growl. Harlan glanced up. Storm clouds were indeed moving in, rolling across the sea with surprising speed. He felt the first shift in the wind, smelled the tang of ozone. This could be an advantage. Stormy weather meant choppy waves that might complicate any further landings or equipment transfers. It also meant reduced visibility for the smugglers. But it would hamper Harlan's movements too, especially if the rains turned the soil to muck. He steeled himself, deciding to use the time before the storm fully broke. He'd try one more major sabotage. If the new skiff landed, perhaps he could disable it before the men fully disembarked, the same way he had done before. He jogged along a hidden path that led closer to the southern beach where a rocky overhang provided partial cover. From there, he could see the skiff carefully entering shallow water. 2 men hopped out up to their knees, pulling the boat forward. Another 2 remained in the skiff, scanning the treeline with rifles raised. Scarface waved them in, shouting directions. Gold Chain stood by the speedboats, which were apparently still in disrepair. Meanwhile, 3 or 4 others formed a perimeter, weapons ready, obviously expecting another ambush. Harlan gritted his teeth. They're learning. They had men specifically watching the flanks. If he tried a direct approach, he'd likely be gunned down. He scouted the shoreline. Large boulders dotted the surf near the beach. If he could slip into the water behind those rocks, maybe he could place a small explosive or simply yank a crucial part off the skiff's engine. Except he had no real explosives aside from a few flares. And physically reaching the skiff amidst so many armed men would be nearly impossible. Lightning flashed on the horizon. The wind picked up, ruffling the palm fronds. Sand swirled across the beach in small gusts. The men shouted over the rising wind, hauling crates off the skiff. Harlan's heart sank. More men, 2 more in paramilitary gear, stepped ashore, immediately fanning out to form a broader perimeter. He counted at least 4 well-armed reinforcements from that skiff, plus the original crew. They were at least 10 strong now, possibly more. Even with sabotage, the odds worsened every minute. He retreated again, feeling frustration coil in his gut. If the main approach was too heavily guarded, perhaps he could strike from another angle, like rigging a landslide or blocking a narrow pass. The island's rocky ridges might allow him to trigger a rockfall, but that would require time and a vantage uphill. Lightning strikes. Thunder boomed and the heavens finally opened. A curtain of tropical rain swept over the island, drenching everything in an instant. Harlan was caught in the downpour, water streaming down his face and arms, plastering his hair to his scalp. Visibility dropped significantly on the beach. The smugglers scrambled to cover their supplies with tarps. The new arrivals rushed to unload the skiff before the waves grew rougher. While the rain battered the canopy, Harlan moved with renewed stealth. Footsteps were masked by the drumming of raindrops, and the gloom of storm clouds provided a kind of twilight. He circled behind the beach area, scanning for an opening. He found one. 2 men had placed a crate on the sand near the jungle's edge, apparently to keep it out of immediate flood zones. They left it unguarded for a moment while they hurried to help with the skiff. Another pair stood watch, but they were more focused on the water, shouting instructions amid the thunderclaps. Harlan crept toward the crate. Rain poured down in sheets, turning the sand dark and wet. He could see the muzzle flashes of lightning flickering across the surf. The thunder masked his approach. When he reached the crate, he quickly used his combat knife to pry at its lid. Inside, he glimpsed rifles, ammunition boxes, and possibly explosives, small bricks wrapped in plastic. A surge of adrenaline kicked in. C4? Dynamite? He couldn't tell for sure, but it looked like some kind of plastic explosive. If that was indeed explosive, it could solve a lot of problems, assuming he could safely ignite it. He rummaged quickly. The top layer was indeed plastic explosive, pressed into small blocks with wires tucked alongside. A separate bag contained detonators. This is no minor smuggling operation. They're geared for a small war. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the entire beach for a split second. Harlan froze, certain someone might spot him crouched there. But the storm was so intense that the men seemed oblivious, their eyes stung by rain, their ears deafened by thunder. Harlan made a split-second decision. He grabbed 2 blocks of the explosive, a few sticks of something that looked like TNT, plus a handful of electronic blasting caps. He stuffed them into his bag, careful not to jostle them too much in the chaos. Then he replaced the lid loosely and slunk back into the jungle. If he could rig an explosive at the boat or cause a controlled detonation near the trawler, he might drive them away. But that's dangerous as hell. He'd have to be careful not to blow himself up. Plans in the deluge. He found temporary shelter under a thick palm cluster, water dripping off the fronds. He set the explosives down carefully on a broad, flat rock, examining them in the intermittent lightning flashes. One block was definitely C4 or a very similar variant, malleable, grayish in color. The other might be a different plastic explosive, similar properties. The TNT was simpler, small waxy cylinders. In the Marines, Harlan had taught advanced demolitions to Special Forces recruits. He understood how to handle small charges. If he had an appropriate blasting cap and a timed fuse or a remote detonator, he could do wonders. He inspected the bag of caps, electronic triggers with short wires. They needed a power source or a remote device to set them off. He also found a coil of fuse cord, presumably for manual ignition. It looked water-resistant. Good enough. Rain hammered the leaves overhead, forming rivulets. The wind gusted, slanting the downpour. Harlan wrapped the materials in an oilcloth from his pack to keep them as dry as possible. Then he thought it through. He could place charges on the big trawler, forcing it to withdraw. But that required somehow boarding it or swimming out there, a near-suicide mission given all the armed men. He could place a charge on the newly arrived skiff or any speedboats they managed to repair, but they might guard those too well. Or he could rig a significant portion of beach to blow if they tried to land more gear. He frowned. The latter option risked catastrophic damage to the island's shoreline, not to mention the possibility of injuring or killing multiple men at once. He didn't relish large-scale bloodshed. But the stakes were high. These cartel enforcers wouldn't hesitate to slaughter him if given a clear shot. Maybe a precise demonstration, a limited explosion that shows them I can wipe them out but gives them a chance to leave. Yes, a demonstration of power might be enough to scare them off. Lightning sizzled again. Harlan decided on a cunning approach, rig a small area near the beach so that if the smugglers advanced or tried to move cargo, he could trigger a blast loud enough and close enough to rattle them. He didn't have to kill them all, just make them realize continuing was folly. He carefully packed away the explosives and fuse lines, then braced himself for another infiltration. A careful setup. As the storm raged on, Harlan circled toward the southern coast once more. He could see waves pounding the shoreline, the ocean whipped into froth. The men had pulled the skiff slightly ashore, lashing it to a palm trunk to keep it from drifting. A few of them huddled under tarps, protecting their crates. Others formed loose patrols around the perimeter, rifles bobbing. Harlan chose a spot about 50 yards inland from the beach, a patch of ground that the smugglers would likely cross if they tried to move further into the island with their cargo. The terrain dipped slightly, creating a natural funnel. Perfect for focusing a blast. He crawled on his belly through muddy ground, each movement agonizingly slow. Rain pelted him, a constant drumbeat. The wind howled, shaking tree limbs overhead. He paused every time a patrolling flashlight beam swept across the area. Finally, he reached a cluster of low boulders. From here, he had a vantage of the path leading from the beach into the interior. He set his bag down, retrieving one block of C4. Working quickly, he molded it against the base of a boulder, pressing it to ensure it stayed put. Then he inserted a blasting cap, attaching the short length of fuse cord. He repeated the procedure with a small chunk of TNT next to a tree trunk about 10 feet away, again with a blasting cap and fuse. He left about a 6-inch gap between the two charges, linking them with some spare cord so they would detonate in unison if triggered properly. The total yield would be enough to blow apart the boulder and send a shockwave across the path, plenty to scare the life out of anyone nearby. To trigger it, he had two options: light the fuse and run, or rig a remote device. He had no specialized remote, but he did find what looked like a battery-operated receiver among the smuggler gear. Without time for complex wiring, he decided a manual fuse would have to do. If push came to shove, he'd lure them, light the fuse, then retreat. He made sure the fuse length was at least 30 seconds, enough time to get clear. Every muscle in his body tensed at the thought of how risky this was. One slip of the fuse in the driving rain, one premature spark, and he'd be a memory. But he forced himself to remain calm, double-checking the connections. When he finished, he carefully concealed the charges under wet leaves and branches, mindful not to bury the fuse beyond reach. Then he slipped away, finding a vantage behind an outcropping of coral stone. From there, he could see the path but remain partially hidden. He had created a literal powder keg. Now I need the right moment. The thunderous message. The storm continued unabated, thunder rolling in successive booms. Men occasionally wandered near the path. Harlan could see them from his vantage, their flashlights bobbing in the gloom. They were mostly patrolling the perimeter, not hauling cargo at the moment. The big crates remained back on the beach. Harlan watched for an ideal opportunity. He wanted a group of them to gather on or near the path enough to witness the explosion up close, but not so close that it would kill them outright. He aimed to deliver a shock, not a massacre. He waited, muscles cramping from crouching so long. Rain soaked through his clothes and mud clung to his boots. His mind drifted briefly, remembering days long ago in the Corps when he'd been teaching recruits about demolitions. Fire in the hole. That cry used to echo across training fields. He never imagined using those lessons quite like this, alone on a remote island. Finally, a sign, Scarface and gold chain, strode up from the beach, accompanied by two new paramilitary arrivals. They were carrying a smaller crate, struggling in the sloshy sand. Scarface barked something about moving it to higher ground. He gestured up the path that led inland. This is it. The four men advanced slowly, cursing the mud. One paramilitary guy led, scanning with a flashlight. Scarface and Gold Chain carried the crate between them while the other paramilitary man watched their six, rifle in hand. Harlan braced himself. If they passed the boulder, they'd be right in the blast zone. But a few yards before the concealed explosives, they paused. Gold Chain set the crate down, panting. "This storm is insane," he groused. "Are you sure we shouldn't wait it out on the beach?" Scarface snarled, "We need to keep the gear safe. The tide's coming in fast, some of it might get washed away." The lead paramilitary man turned to him. "Where are we even going with it?" Scarface gestured vaguely inland. "We'll store it in that abandoned shack or somewhere else away from the tide. The old man can't sabotage everything if we guard it." They resumed trudging forward, drawing closer. Harlan's heart raced, waiting until they were near the trap. Lightning lit the sky, illuminating the scene like a strobe. Scarface was in the middle, splashing through a puddle only about 6 feet from the hidden charges. Harlan yanked out his lighter, an old Zippo, and a small piece of fuse extension he'd prepared. He pressed the Zippo's wheel, igniting a tiny flame that sputtered in the wind. With trembling precision, he lit the extension, which was connected to the main fuse line by a short strip of dry tinder he'd sheltered under his jacket. The flame hissed. He had maybe 30 seconds, less, if the fuse burned faster in the wet conditions. Dropping the lighter, he turned and sprinted, hugging the boulders for cover. Adrenaline spiked through him like lightning. He needed enough distance to avoid the blast, but he also wanted to see the effect. Meanwhile, the smugglers continued. The lead paramilitary man suddenly froze, shining his flashlight down at the ground. Harlan heard him shout, "Wait, something." Boom! The explosion ripped the air, a thunderous roar that dwarfed even the storm's cacophony. A plume of mud, rocks, and debris shot upward, lit by a flash of orange fire. The boulder shattered, sending chunks of stone in all directions. Trees rattled, leaves swirling in a violent gust. Harlan, from his partial cover, felt the concussive wave slam his body. Ears rang, chest tightened. The ground shook. He crouched lower, arms over his head. Screams and shouts tore through the veil of sound. He risked a glance, smoke and debris obscured the path. A tree had split near the base, leaning precariously. The paramilitary men were thrown back. He saw a figure writhing on the ground, another staggering away, blood on his forehead. The crate had been flung aside, broken open. Scarface lay sprawled in the mud, coughing, his vest torn. Gold Chain was on hands and knees, disoriented, hair matted with mud. The paramilitary men looked worse off. One was unconscious or dead. The other stumbled, trying to stand. Harlan's stomach twisted. He hadn't intended for a lethal blast, but the results were violent. He told himself it was them or him, that he'd used minimal charges, but the effect of even a small explosive was terrifying at close range. As the smoke billowed, the rest of the smugglers on the beach erupted into chaos. Some rushed forward, guns raised, but they hesitated at the sight of the crater. Others ducked behind crates, scanning the jungle in terror. Lightning flared overhead, thunder boomed, and the rain pounded everything in a surreal, warlike tableau. Harlan took a deep breath and shouted from behind cover, voice echoing, "Leave this island. Next time, I'll bury you all." Whether they heard him clearly or not, the image of that explosion was enough to shake them. He could see men glancing at each other with stark fear. Scarface tried to rise, sputtering curses, but he staggered. Gold Chain fell back down, groaning in pain. Aftershock. For a tense minute, no one returned fire. They were too stunned. Then a volley of shots rang out, wild, disorganized. Bullets zipped through the rainy air, hitting branches and ground. Harlan pressed himself against the rock, letting them expend their fury blindly. He realized he was trembling, partly from adrenaline, partly from the raw shock of the explosion. "I have to move," he told himself, forcing his limbs to obey. "They'll come for me soon." He ducked away, circling through the dense brush, careful to avoid any stray rounds. As he slipped further into the jungle, he heard frantic cries in Spanish. "Medic! Alguien está herido! Maldition, my leg's bleeding. Where did he go? Where's this demon?" Harlan's chest felt tight, but he kept moving, weaving between palm trunks. He delivered a catastrophic blow to their morale and inflicted real casualties. He had to hope it was enough to convince them to give up. The wages of war. Eventually, he reached a small clearing near the western slope, breathing hard. Rain still drenched him, though the thunder was rolling farther away. Perhaps the brunt of the storm was passing. The sky remained a chaotic swirl of gray, but he spotted a faint brightness to the west. He slid down the side of a boulder, limbs shaking with exhaustion. Blood dripped from a minor cut on his forearm, probably from flying debris. His ears still rang from the blast. Old images flashed in his mind, young recruits in training, the thunderous echo of a controlled detonation, the aftermath in real combat zones overseas. He pressed a hand to his chest, fighting off the swirl of memories. This was the life he'd hoped to leave behind. He forced himself to focus on the present. The explosion would drastically slow the smugglers' operation, but it might also incite them to call in even heavier backup. One wave after another, he thought grimly. Unless... He recalled the paramilitary men's mention of the boss being furious. Possibly that boss would demand they either secure the island or cut their losses. By striking so forcefully, Harlan might have tilted them toward retreat. But he couldn't rest yet. If they still tried to unload cargo or fix their speedboats, they might linger. If the big ship came in with more men, he might be outmatched. 20. The enemy's response. After a short rest, Harlan moved to a vantage overlooking the southern beach again, this time from a higher rocky crag about 200 yards away. The worst of the storm was easing, though rain still fell in a steady drizzle. The beach was a mess. Debris from the crates littered the sand. The path where Harlan had set the explosives was now a churned-up crater. He spotted a group of men carrying their wounded back to the beach. One paramilitary man had a makeshift bandage over his head, stumbling with support. Another was on a makeshift stretcher, leg twisted at an odd angle. Two men were clearly dead, their bodies covered with tarps. Harlan recognized the fresh reinforcements among the casualties, some from that new skiff. Scarface sat on a crate near the shore, a medic of some sort wrapping his arm. He looked dazed, blood running from a cut above his eyebrow. Gold Chain stood beside him, limping, face white with shock. They were alive, but battered. The threat of a near-death explosion had clearly shaken them. Harlan scanned for the paramilitary man in the militia vest. He didn't see him. Either he was still inland or among the wounded. The big smuggler trawler rocked offshore, too far for Harlan to see details. He assumed they'd witnessed the explosion from the deck. Perhaps they were radioing their superiors or deciding whether to send more men. Harlan observed Scarface gesturing angrily at the boat, then pointing to the battered skiff. It looked like the outboard had sustained damage from flying debris or maybe from the initial infiltration. One or two men tried tinkering with it, but they seemed reluctant, fearful of another sabotage or explosion. In short, the smugglers looked demoralized. They had wounded, minimal progress made on establishing a foothold, an unpredictable enemy who just proved he could blow them to pieces. A flicker of hope rose in Harlan's chest. They might cut their losses. Tense negotiations. Hours dragged on. Rain fell intermittently. The tide went out, leaving the big trawler afloat in deeper water. Occasionally, Harlan saw them raise a signal or wave from the deck, but no more small boats approached. Possibly they were out of workable watercraft or too afraid. On the beach, Scarface and Gold Chain conferred with the older, stubble-faced newcomer who'd apparently survived. They seemed to be arguing, voices raised. Then the older man took a radio and barked something to the trawler. Harlan wished he could hear more clearly. He had a vantage that let him see some smugglers pacing anxiously. A few sat by the crates, heads in their hands. The paramilitary men, likely with some chain of command in mind, were in heated debate. Finally, as the afternoon sun broke through a gap in the clouds, Harlan spotted movement. Scarface took a white cloth, a piece of tarp, and tied it to a branch. Waving it overhead, he stepped away from the group and called into the jungle. "Oiga, we want to talk." His Spanish carried across the wet sand, shaky but loud. "Old man, we can negotiate." Harlan stiffened. A negotiation ploy could be a trap. But if they truly wanted to talk, it might be contraband, cleaning up the residual mess, repairing his shack. Then maybe he could find peace again. At last, he guided the Arcadia back into the shelter of the island's cove, dropping anchor near the same spot. The sun was high and bright. The tide was gentle, as if the island itself welcomed him home. He left the boat and trudged across the sand, rifle in hand. The hush of the place enveloped him. The footprints and bullet casings from days earlier were mostly erased by wind and rain. The silent jungle stood as it always had, a testament to nature's resilience. 34. The island remains. In the days that followed, Harlan methodically cleaned up the remnants of the smugglers' incursion. He gathered the leftover weapons and ammunition from the cave and from the beach, pondering how best to dispose of them. Ultimately, he decided to store them in a deep alcove within the cave, sealing it with rocks. If the cartel returned in force, he might need them. But for now, they posed a risk left out in the open. He also had a significant stash of narcotics he had no interest in keeping. He burned what he could in a controlled fire pit near the shore, smoke curling skyward. Some of it he weighted down with rocks and dropped into a trench beyond the reef, hoping it would sink beyond reach. It felt oddly cathartic, destroying the toxic cargo. Each morning he woke early, performed his stretching routine, and surveyed the horizon for suspicious vessels. Each evening, he patrolled the paths he'd once rigged with tripwire alarms, removing or resetting them as needed. He found solace in the daily tasks. Life had never been simple, but out here, at least, the tasks were straightforward. He also repaired his shack more thoroughly, patching holes, replacing burnt planks, even rebuilding the small balcony that overlooked the beach. Bit by bit, the place took shape again as a modest refuge. At night, though, nightmares returned. The sight of wounded men on the beach, the deafening explosion, the flash of muzzle fire. Old wars melding with new violence. He'd awake in a cold sweat, hand reflexively grasping for the pistol under his makeshift pillow. Still, day by day, the island's familiar rhythms soothed him. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and new beginnings. Pelicans dove for fish in the shallows. Occasionally, Harlan spotted a distant fishing boat passing by, but none dared approach after hearing rumors of gunfire or seeing charred debris. 35. A visitor at sunset. One late afternoon, as the sky rippled with gold and lavender, Harlan lounged near the shack. He'd just finished reinforcing the roof with additional palm fronds. Warm, humid air pressed against his skin, and he sipped water from a hollowed gourd. He thought he heard a faint engine sound. Tensing, he stood, scanning the horizon. But the sound came from the western side, near the cove where his sloop was anchored. Carefully, he made his way in that direction, M4 at the ready. Rounding a bend, he saw a small fishing skiff puttering toward the island, a single figure at the helm. Harlan dropped low, behind a ridge of coral. Not again, he thought, heart-pounding. But then he recognized the man in the boat. Julio, the fisherman who had first warned him of the smugglers' approach days ago. Relief flooded Harlan. He shouldered his rifle, stepping into view. Julio saw him and waved, though his face carried evident concern. Harlan helped pull the skiff onto the sand, noticing Julio's nervous glances at the bullet-riddled trees and the faint scorch marks around the cove. "Mr. Finch," Julio said softly, doffing his straw hat. I heard rumors of gunfire and an explosion. My village, they worried for you." Harlan exhaled, offering a wry smile. "I had some uninvited guests, but they're gone now." Julio nodded grimly. "I am sorry I could not do more to help." Harlan shook his head. "No need. You warned me when you could have stayed silent. That was enough." They stood a moment, the lap of waves at their ankles. Then Julio reached into his skiff, lifting a small basket. "I brought some provisions, rice, dried beans, some fruit." He offered them up. "I figured you might need restocking." Harlan accepted them with a nod of gratitude. "Thank you. I appreciate it." Julio hesitated, voice quiet. "Are you going to stay here after what happened?" Harlan gazed across the tranquil beach, the shadows of palm fronds dancing on the sand. Despite everything, it was still home, his chosen retreat. "Yes," he finally said. "I'm staying." 36. Epilogue: Solitude and Resolve. In the months that followed, no new smugglers appeared. Rumors drifted along the coast about a cursed island where a lone Marine had single-handedly repelled a cartel. Some believed the story was exaggerated. Others swore it was gospel. Either way, word spread that the place was best avoided. Harlan continued his simple existence. He fished, tended a small garden in a clearing, rebuilt his shack into something sturdier, more fortified. The contraband he couldn't destroy remained hidden, a lingering reminder that conflict could return. But for now, peace reigned among the palms. The scars of the battle slowly healed. Burned foliage regrew, bullet holes in trees scarred over. The crater in the jungle filled in with debris and undergrowth. The island itself seemed resilient, as though it had seen worse in centuries past and would see more in centuries to come. At times, Harlan reflected on the choice he had made, to defend rather than flee, to use violence in the name of solitude. He wondered if it might have been different, had the smugglers tried to negotiate from the start. Probably not, he concluded. Cartels rarely parley in good faith. Occasionally, in the hush of dusk, he remembered the guilt of that explosion, the men he'd injured or killed. The memories haunted him, yet he found a solemn acceptance. He was a man shaped by war who wanted peace. Sometimes to protect what you love, a measure of violence can't be avoided. He never again saw Manuel or Cruz. Whether they found new lives or fell back into the cartel's grip, he didn't know. Sometimes he thought he glimpsed a fishing boat on the horizon, or a silhouette that might be them. But no one landed on his shores, and no one disturbed his quiet routine. And so, on a remote island once earmarked for illicit smuggling, an old retired Marine combat instructor lived out his days. He rose with the sun, did his stretches on the sand, listened to the hush of the breeze through the palms, and watched each glorious sunset unafraid. The storms might come again, but he would be ready.